Hi, how's everybody doing? As has sort of become the custom, I thought I'd start this week with another video, so I hope you enjoy these beginning videos. I hope they're helpful to help you think about the week and how it relates to the previous week. It's sort of a fun way, I think, to start the week and just to connect with people in the class. I'm really enjoying the class. I like the discussion boards a lot. It's fun to hear what people say. In some ways, it's a lot more fun than a traditional class because so many people are engaged in the discussions, and we really get to hear people's thoughtful points of view. I think the discussion forums have been a really valuable place to build knowledge. So I've had a lot of fun with that. That said, I just want to start by reminding everybody, keep up with the discussion forums. Make sure you post your first post by Thursday and responses by Sunday. You want to do that so that you're in dialogue with the other students, so that you guys can respond to one another. Because if you post after Sunday, the responses aren't quite as valuable because people might not even be able to read them. So do that. I noticed that some people are catching up with some other things that they had missed before, so I'm going to go through the entire first several weeks because sometimes it's not reliable about telling me when people have posted things. I'm going to go through all those weeks and check, and if there's any work that people had made up, I'll give you at least partial credit for that work. If you want to get full credit, you need to make sure you post those things on time. So keep up with the discussions, though. Keep up with the journals, and you'll do well in here. As for poetry, hopefully everybody's been enjoying the poetry unit. I think that we've read some really good poems in here, and we've covered a lot of really interesting aspects of poems. We talked about the speaker, imagery, metaphor, and I think people were really drawn to metaphor, which they should be. That's really one of the heights of poetry, is the effect of metaphor. Irony, I think our videos on irony were good. I think a lot of people really latched on to irony too and noticed it in lots of different poems. And last week we talked about sound, and again, people really were able to identify well repetition and how repetition plays in a poem, and onomatopoeia and things like that. I'm not sure how it went with the meter. We had the journal on meter, which I'm going to take a look at soon. I did get a few emails from people who were kind of confused about the meter, so it's one of the hardest features of poem is understanding meter. And I think it's easy, especially in contemporary people studying reading poetry, to sort of see meter as antiquated and not really that relevant or not really that important to a poem, when a lot of our great poets now don't even use any meter at all. But meter has been such an important part of poetry's history, really up until the late 1800s. All the great poets wrote in meter. Petrarch, Shakespeare, Lord Byron, Milton, Keats, all of these poets, Yeats, wrote in meter. And as I mentioned in one part in the discussion forum, some people really just study the ways they used meter and the changes they made in meter. And in a lot of ways, meter and sound were much more important to poets, a while ago than they are necessarily now, where imagery and metaphor is more important to poets. But when we're studying the older poems especially, we really need to keep an ear towards meter and keep an idea of what's the rhythm of the poem and why did the poet choose this particular pattern of rhythm, and where do we notice variations in the rhythm. And again, I don't expect everybody to come away and be masterful at scansion, but at least if you can get an idea of how to scan a poem and understand meter and see some of the variations, that's a good place to be. This week we're going to continue talking about poems, and we're going to talk about form in poetry. And this is kind of the last piece of the puzzle before next week, where we're going to have our essay 2, which is a literary comparison essay, where we're going to have you compare two poems in the different ways the author uses features. Actually, I'm going to have you pick 2 out of a series of 10 love poems and kind of compare the techniques that the authors use in creating those love poems. So that'll be fun. But we'll talk about form today, and all poems have form, right? Form refers to the shape of the poem, right? So Bob Hickok's poem, Making It in Poetry, is just a short little poem, and I think that's important because it's sort of about his insignificance as a poet, and I think that fits that form well. Sonnets tend to be, blockier, square-like forms. Other poems are much bigger with longer lines, like the Wordsworth poem that we read, The Solitary Reaper. So all poems have shape, which could just be, using stanzas or how poets use stanzas or the length of the lines. So that's the form of the poetry. But there are also received forms, or forms that have been kind of passed down through history, that many poets have used and that poets continue to use because it's a challenge to try to write well in that particular form and that particular constraint. A good example of a form that lots of people are familiar with is the haiku. Right? A haiku is a 3-line poem. The first line has to have 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables. I have an example over here of Bashaw's famous poem, "An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again." It's a nice poem. It's one of the more famous short haikus. But it's challenging to write, in syllables. And the sonnet also has a tradition of always being about nature and being about some kind of interesting insight into nature. And they're sort of meditative, right? Things that allow you to clear your mind. So all those are wrapped up into the haiku form. And there's lots of other forms in poetry, and you're going to get a chance to look at all of them through our reading this week in the form chapter. It has several different types, and it gives examples of each. And I'm going to have you read several of those. So like you're going to read about villanelles, and villanelle is probably one of the most complex forms there is, and there's a really good villanelle in there, which is like the only great villanelle ever written, by Dylan Thomas, "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night." I think you'll really enjoy that poem. Plus, we're going to read about limericks, right? Limericks are kind of funny, humorous poems that are meant to pick on things. And we're going to talk about, the form that you need to know about, which is the sonnet. The most important, most significant form. People have been writing sonnets for about 700 years. Petrarch was the first, and he had his own style of sonnets. Shakespeare wrote the sonnet, and many poets throughout history wrote sonnets at some point, even right up to the contemporary. We have people today still writing sonnets, and you're going to read contemporary sonnets. And poets love writing sonnets because when you write a sonnet, you're engaging in the tradition of that sonnet, and trying to reshape or recast what the sonnet can do. Traditionally, the sonnet is a 14-line poem that's about love, right? Loosely. Although there's a lot of good traction on anti-love poems being sonnets. Shakespeare's My Mistress's Eyes is a good example of a sonnet, and it's about love, but it's also kind of an anti-love poem. So we'll read several more this week, and there's different forms of sonnet too. Shakespeare had his own style of sonnet, where he would have 12 lines that present something and 2 lines that kind of wrap it up or undercut it, which is the case with Mistress's Eyes. Petrarch had his own type of sonnet where he wrote 8 lines and then usually a question in 8 lines and then an answer in the 6 lines. So there's different ways of writing sonnets, and we'll read a little bit more about them this week. And I think they'll be particularly helpful moving into next week, where you're going to do a literary analysis of 2 poems, a comparison of 2 poems that are love poems, and some of those poems are sonnets, so it's helpful to know how the sonnet operates. So we'll do that this week. We'll talk about the sonnet. We're also going to talk a little bit about blank verse and free verse. And I'm going to have you read one of the most famous free verse poems ever written. It's maybe one of the most famous poems ever written. It's the quintessential modernist poem by T.S. Eliot called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's longer. It's like 110 lines, so it's a lot longer than some of the other poems that we've been reading, and I hope it's not like too torturous for people. I know that poem can be confusing in lots of ways, but stick with it. Read it a few times, spend some time with this poem, because it's really a fantastic poem. If you can, get past some of the craziness that happens in the poems with the repetition and the stanzas that seem to jump into nowhere. At its core, it's about a guy, right? J. Alfred Prufrock, who's an invented guy, who's just like a case study of the modern man. He's modern meaning like early 1900s, not today's standard. He's very anxious. He's living in an industrial world, and he doesn't know how to make his way. He doesn't understand social cues. He's nervous. He's not glamorous. He's the anti-hero to the Romantics, right? The Romantics were people like Keats and Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper poem. The Romantics loved to sort of glorify the world and make everything beautiful and about art, and the Modernists were the exact opposite. They said, no, the world is like a gritty, real, raw place, and people are nervous and anxious, and they don't really understand their place in the world. And T.S. Eliot writes like that, and that's what Love Song J. Alfred Prufrock is getting at. So I'm going to have you, for one of our discussions, post something about J. Alfred Prufrock. What do you like about the poem? It's got some beautiful metaphors, some beautiful imagery, some nice repetition. So pick something. What do you like about the poem? Some sound, some observations. One of my favorite lines is in that poem. I've measured out my life in coffee spoons. I love that metaphor. It's perfect. I think of it all the time. And another one is the beginning of the poem, probably the best beginning of a poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. I love that simile. It really, it's complex, right? Like, what is he saying about the evening? And it's and the image of a patient etherized upon a table is disturbing. It's good. So, well, read it, see what you think. Post something about that. I'm sort of droning on here. So I'll end, and then next week I'll be back with a new video, and I'm also going to have a video, demonstrating a comparative literary analysis essay, and we'll talk about that. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the discussions. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you then.